You might. Okay. Oh, hello. Uh, good morning, Linda. Thank you so much for inviting me and including me in this really interesting kind of combination of issues that different fields are really dealing with. I want to especially draw light to the fact that some of the ideas that you have mentioned with regard to my own work gained some traction from taking a seminar that Matthew was also in 25 years ago at the University of Chicago. So I am indebted to you for supporting alternate lines of inquiry where it has led me productively today. So, and thank you very much for hosting us so nicely. Emily has arranged everything so well. So without further ado, I will talk about my title obliquely. You know how titles go. Sometimes you have an idea and then it changes, but the mudfish will appear, not to worry. So I have a presentation in two parts. The first part is what I'm calling an aesthetic of collaboration and secrecy. And the main point of the first 10 minutes or so is to show you how there is really no separation between art and science and medicine in certain historical African cultures. And we're going to do that by exploring a certain class of power object that's coming from neighboring cultures in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And one thing that is a kind of tension and also something that animates the way these objects are used is the concept of secrecy. So I'd like you to pay attention to how objects are showing you something and withholding something at the same time, and how many different components and materials and people are involved in the production of what we're about to see. And then also to think about, well, what is the point of these objects? Who made them and why? And so the sort of, you know, our kind of desire to return to the origin of an object, who made it, when, you know, what exactly is the material, that kind of scientific analysis that we do as art historians is somehow not permitted in these objects by virtue of what their purpose is in their original communities. This is a series of three types of objects. So we're looking at a class of objects. It's a power object called an Nkisi and Konde. And these are large communal power objects. And they're about 1.5 to 2 feet high. They vary in size. And they are from Congo culture with a K. And what you're seeing here is a wooden core that is carved by a sculptor. I'm afraid of doing anything with this thing. And you can see a very sort of finely semi-naturalistic face here as well, the mouth open, teeth there. Many different materials, which you can all understand by just looking. So a wooden core that has kind of exploded with nails, sacrificial materials, feathers, animal parts. This guy's spear is missing, but this is meant to be a threatening composition. This is meant to scare you. It's meant to sort of stop you in your tracks. And it accomplishes that not only by virtue of its surface, but also by the participation of the sculptor in creating the presence of the Inkisi through that kind of jutting forward of the chin, the eyes open, the mouth open, the ability to sort of receive, but also attack at the same time. Now, what is the purpose of these objects? Why do they have these nails? Nails are a precious commodity in West Africa, not just nails, but metal in general. And these are oath-taking figures, these two especially here. And what happens is that in order to sign, seal pacts, whether they have to do with, land disputes or whether they have to do with, don't marry my sister, there's a bond, a physical bond through licking a nail or attaching a piece of hair and sealing it into the body of this object that then ensures that on penalty of the Inkisi coming after you, that you will adhere to the promises that you've made. And so when you look at something like this and it's entirely covered front to back, side to side in nails, it's announcing to you its own efficacy that so many people have sort of invested in it to ensure some good in their lives. They will also have mirrors here and here as well. And I'll talk about that in a second. This is another of the same type of object from the same culture. These are all 19th to 20th century objects. Okay, so looking at this one is at the Met. And here you can begin to now understand some questions that the object itself resists from the perspective of art history. So for example, look at how long this label is, right? I mean, this took me a long time to put together. What we have here is unrecorded sculpture and a priest, an nganga. And this is what I mean by a collaborative aesthetic. What it looks like has very little to do with the head and the body of the sculptor. It has a lot to do with what's happening on its surface all the way around it. And the reason for that is that it's being activated. It's being sort of deployed to do the work that it's supposed to do through the insertion of sacrificial materials, through the insertion of different kinds of potent animal hides like leopards and lions, through the insertion of objects that have meaning within the culture. This is a crossroads carving, meaning this is a place where two different types of existences meet, the world of here and the world of the departed, or in some sense, the ancestral realm. And then this one is further accentuated by little tiny Inkisi here and here. And so these are also reminders to the viewer who would use an object like this. They would also have their own personal power objects, right? So there's a kind of intimate relationship that can be established between a user and a maker here. But fundamentally, what we're looking at is this kind of duality of making, of a priest who understands how to channel forces that will activate what is an inert matter. It's a piece of wood. And without all of this kind of bundles and injections of power, it is really it's valueless object. And that's kind of against the grain of art history, right? We want to see the complete work of art as the sculptor did. And the sculptor here, you'll see that wood carving in Africa frequently will have a stain that is very, very dark that has nothing to do with the wood itself. It's been darkened through the continuous application of palm oil. And a dealer, because this is in the Met now, and a dealer somewhat in the 40s polished this off. So what you have is some remnants of the light wood that it's actually made out of coming through. So this is a perfect object that resists art historical and museum thinking. I'll show you how these things were actually made, and there's stages of making something like this. First, you need a reason to make something like this. This is a neighboring culture, Songhay culture, also in the DRC. And this, I'm using some field work and some archival materials from Dunya Herzak, who worked there in that region in the 70s. And you see a sculptor starts with a very large blade. This is the color of the wood, okay, of the object I'll show you in the end. He delivers this sculpted object to a priest or a diviner. There's lots of different language that you can use to talk about the priest or diviner, but he is a person who has the ability to effect change, bodily change, existential change. either for an individual or for a community. And so the Nganga, whoops. Okay. The Nganga here, the priest, is showing the complete object delivered like this, okay? Showing the complete object. Here you see that these objects, once they are anointed in certain ways and ritualized, you cannot actually ever touch them again. So you've got these stilts by which they're manipulated and held up and moved around when they're needed. They're kept in the chief's house. They're frequently not shown. They're only brought out on the occasion of a particular catastrophe or a need for cleansing for the community. This is a museum example, and this one, again, is a Sangye power figure, and Sangye power figures are different in aesthetic than the Congo figures we were looking at. They do have a kind of cumulative surface, but this is about retaining that power. It's not about sort of ejecting it. It's about having it inside the receptacle, if you can consider a sculpture a receptacle. And so metal is here to seal in the medicines that have been embedded, deeply embedded into the sculpture itself. And then it's also dressed with hides, etc. Even here in the eyes, nails are used to seal in, the eyes not looking out. You'll see that it is kind of naturalistic. Sure, it sort of resembles a human head. However, everything has been enlarged and almost sort of puffy in a way. And that kind of sense of breaking out is that there's so much power within that it has to be sealed for it not to be, for it not to explode. X-rays of the object show us certain materials that are not seen on the surface. And we have a bell up here in the back of the object. You can see that there are certain bits of metal at the back as well. And so the secrecy element, the special combination of ingredients that allows you it's okay. It's not really alive. It's not going anywhere. So here so here you can see on the internal dynamics. That's what's really important in creating the sense of authority that this object has. We'll see it in another form. And this is the Monzino collections Sangye object. And what you see here is the blue bits, right, up here in the stomach and in the anus, head, stomach, anus, is all connected. A hot copper rod is driven through the head of the sculpture, and that connects the most important parts where the medicinal substances have been embedded. And why is it connected? Is it a digestive system? Not really. It's really meant to keep those elements in contact with one another, not for them to come out. They're sealed. So this region here is sealed. The stomach is sealed. You've seen the mouth sealed as well. And so it's a sense of containment and control of containment that can be unleashed on the occasion of, depending on the circumstances. The mangaka power objects, this goes back to the first things I showed you. These are also Congo power figures, and these are also oath-taking figures. You can see through the addition of many, many pieces of metal around the central cavity, okay? These were made in a very short period of time between 1900 or so and 1930 and confiscated by French officials. And so what we see again is these are a combination. The sculpture furnishes the form, and that has to then be completed through the insertion of magico-religious materials, organic materials, sacrificial materials into the central cavity, okay? And here you can see the difference in these two. This one's central cavity has been kind of excavated, means it has been desacralized. It's no longer has any value for its original communities. And so many communities did that deliberately to take out that material so that when it arrived in England or in France or wherever it went, that it would not be able to do any harm, that it could not be used to enact any kind of activity that was not intended on the behalf of the Nganga or the mangaka figure itself. Here, on the other hand, you'll see there's a cowrie shell, and this would have been closed. So this is, again, you would never know or see what these materials were. But in this case, the shell was replaced. In this case, this is the Met's figure. The skirt's missing, poor guy, and also the central cavity. X-rays from yet another type of this mangaka figure shows you how behind the eyes, these come off, they're little plastic lids actually. You have pieces of metal behind them. Metal itself is controlled by the god Ogun, and the idea of metal being a potent force that has a limited presence in creating objects is also there to enhance the power of the figure here. But again, behind the eyes, somebody knows it's there, but it will never be revealed to you. Now we're doing a little bit of, we're going a little extra. We're not supposed to be doing this to these objects by x-raying them and doing a little museum work here. You know, initially we were never supposed to know about this. One more Sangye power figure. And here I just want to pivot to the second part of the presentation, which is really about thinking about how animals and certain types of animals and their behaviors become surrogates for power in West African communities. And my case study, the reason why I have the Sangye object here is that all this head crest is filled with the feathers of birds of prey. And so what ends up happening is that you harness the violent and cunning potential of certain types of animals. And that also becomes in the sort of repertoire of this object behavior. So the mudfish, which were famously advertised. Now, the case study for the mudfish and the idea of animals being able to project power on the behalf of a sovereign is something that goes back hundreds of years and is used in many different cultures, of course. Looking where we are right now, we're going to be looking at, no, what's happened? No, all right, I'll just move forward. Okay, so we are now in the coast of Africa, and we're looking at a place called Benin City. That's where the famous Benin bronzes come from, on the coast, and close to, of course, Portugal, which will become important for us, but also sort of at the confluence of many rivers in the grasslands of Nigeria. So this is not Benin, the country, this is Benin City, which is Edo State in Nigeria, two totally different Benins. Benin has existed for hundreds of years as a centralized, incredibly forceful center in West Africa. The earliest depictions from a European point of view is from the 17th century, and you can see the city of Benin and the palace. These are the most sort of wonderful examples we have of commemorative heads of Obas, the kings of Benin. And they are made out of metal. The very early ones are very, very thinly cast because of the availability of metal at that time. As trade becomes more and more intense, you have more and more metal, and then you also see a complete change in style in the later heads. But another thing to remember, of course, is that this is a continuous tradition of casting the head of an Oba when a new Oba is installed. And so even though there is a break, which I'll talk about in a second, between the line that originates in the 14th century and goes all the way up to the 19th century. This is Oba Akenzua II. Okay, one second. Right, so this is Oba Akenzua II greeting the Queen of England. Okay, there she is, poor Philip. always off to the side. And this is in bronze, okay? And in bronze, the casting of bronze is really important in this particular region because the word to remember in Edo means literally to cast a motif in bronze. So bronze is the legitimizing of history. It is the record of history. It needs to be encased in bronze for it to have happened. So this is the photograph, of course, taking from the perspective of showing Elizabeth. This is giving priority to the Oba himself. The break that I just mentioned, I'm just bringing this here just so you know that, yes, all of this happened. I'm not going to be talking about restitution. This is the sack of Benin by the British in 1897, which is why all of these objects are now in museum collections. But we need to also think about what were their original contexts of these things. Well, you had a palace, and this is the palace, in a plaque that was shown, and these plaques were attached to the walls of the palace. You see that here? This is a detail of one of these figures. And these multi-figure plaques are incredibly supple, ingeniously cast. This is an example of a single figure that would have been there. So this one shows us the palace with the plaques in situ. Now they're no longer able to be shown that way. But what it also does is give us a link to the ways that there are surrogates for the power of the king. And this one is particularly good at that. And what you have here are leopards. And here you have the mudfish and the oba in the center. He's holding the leopards by the tail, showing his own power, of course, twirling them around like little cats. And then the mudfish that are sort of drooping, framing his lower half on the other side. Both are representative of the power of the king. As the leopard is the sort of controller of the bush, so the oba is the master of the land, right? Of the civilized portion of land. And the mudfish is an interesting animal, which I'll get to in a second. There's a huge fishing festival that still goes on in northern Nigeria. Fish and mudfish are incredibly important in this region and have been for hundreds of years. I ventured to give you a scientific rendering of a mudfish here. And the unique thing about a mudfish, as you probably know, is that it's a lungfish. So it's able to breathe on land and breathe in water. And that becomes emblematic of the dual nature of the oba being fully divine and fully human at the same time. And so that's why you will see mudfish in the Benin bronzes all over. So sometimes they're shown entirely on their own. For example, in these two here, that's the back of this. And sometimes they're shown, in different poses. And these references are all references to water, the realm of the ocean. And why is that important? The mudfish is not only important in its dual nature, accessing the oba's dual nature, but the arrival of the Portuguese in the 15th century. In the 15th century, you have these intimate networks established of trade between the Portuguese and the Kingdom of Benin. And so here what you're seeing are the salt cellars that were made for export. So you see the Portuguese are depicted in their full regalia. It's a contemporary painting, which sort of approximates these very elaborate tights, skirt, outer garment, the cross, of course. For an African sculptor, you were looking at a long, tight nose and very straight hair. That is the way the Portuguese are depicted, but they also bring an incredible amount of wealth to the kingdom. And so they're also shown in the plaques. This is a plaque that would have been in the palace showing the Portuguese with their little bowler hats. And this is an item of export. Exporting ivory, bringing in metal was a hugely affluent trade. And so the Portuguese also serve as surrogates for an idea of prosperity. And prosperity is also a very big part of how the Queen Mother plays a role in the life of the court of Benin. This is a very famous mask. This is in the Met collection. There are two very famous ones. One is at the British Museum and one is at the Met. And this is the queen mother of a famous Oba who consolidated the kingdom and won battles in the 16th century. And so what you see here, this is ivory, of course. What you see on the crest of her hair here is alternating Portuguese mudfish, there you are, Portuguese mudfish, right? They almost become the same as they're moving around her head. And so she has this very special relationship to the god of the sea. And she is also said to control prosperity and to be able to summon the Portuguese to come if they've been away for a long period of time. And so you'll see that a few things are missing here, and here, and these are pieces of metal that would have been there again to intensify the power of this object. That's the one at the British Museum. You'll see a lot of similarity in terms of style. They are meant to represent the same queen mother, and they probably were made at the same time. The back of these show you the cavity on the inside. So here, the nostrils and the mouth. The cavity on the inside is there for a couple of different purposes. These two were so incredibly important and valuable. You have to remember that metal and ivory is controlled by the king, and metal and ivory objects are made only for the king. So having an object like this, it would have been packed on the interior here with magico-religious materials. And then as their pendants, so they would have sat on either side of the king's head, essentially, both of those. And the medicinal material would have been very close to his body. And so there is something that is visually, ravishing looking at this, but what you really sort of have on the inside, that sort of intimate contact, is something that is not delivered visually to an audience. And so I think I'm going to just end with this quick comparison of maybe refamiliarizing a foreign object, which is how much we rely on what we don't see to experience certain works of art in history. Just giving you the example of Ithaca, the Queen Mother. On the right is a medieval reliquary, which you guys are all familiar with, I'm sure. This one is at the Met. It's a skull reliquary of Saint Eryx. And in the center is Damien Hirst, For the Love of God, from 2007. And Damien Hirst is drawing our attention to how much of our rhetoric of images, right, about what we really value about an image historically, is in fact relies on the visual to actually produce meaning and to create a convincing argument. So imagine, the detritus of relics, which are bones, hair, etc., without gold, silver, gems, rock crystal, etc. Medievalists, you know the composition of a reliquary. Come on, where are we? Okay, right. So without this, what we consider to be the artfulness of this composition, it does not reconstitute a broken body, is what a reliquary does, and to ensure the sort of living nature of that saint elsewhere for the faithful to direct their prayers. Same thing with visibility and invisibility. Here, you have the actual skull, right? But it's covered in materials that doesn't obscure its origin at all. It is still a dead skull that is filled with millions of pounds of platinum and diamonds. And so visibility and invisibility, art historically, we can go at this in one way, but really what animates, what really gives it importance, where its use value was, which is what was very important to their communities, is something that we fundamentally cannot see and cannot know. So I'll just leave you with that.
Thank you so much. That was great. I have so many questions, both kind of trivial and less trivial. First of all, I always thought the, most interesting, or I mean, I don't know much of anything about mudfish, except that they can survive when, for very long periods when, the water that they're in dries up. And so I wonder if that played any part at all in their, status as power, as denoting power, long enduring. Is there any evidence of that?
Absolutely. I'm highlighting the aspect that is most commented upon in the oral history, is that sense of occupying both land and sea, which is so, which is impossible really. But what you're talking about, that dormancy and then the ability to come back, that is sometimes used in proverbs that refer directly to the king is there, the king is not active necessarily or on the prowl in some way, but always able to.
Kind of like the king's two bodies.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And if I just ask one more question, which is, what if we took the power objects as being our paradigm for an art historical object, right? Rather than, the difference that Linda pointed out yesterday, that objects had work to do. These objects have work to do. And this is not relevant to this conference, but what if that was our central object? What if art history had started with those objects? Would we examine them with x-rays, do you think? How would that change our methods and our thinking about what an object is?
I think that's a great question, because one of the challenges of African art is that you're always starting from a different object and then trying to figure out how this object fits in with our ideas of sculpture, of performance, etc. I think, what you're referring to, a kind of, Men in Black type scenario of like, boom, you don't have your art history anymore, and here's art history. I wondered what we would do that. That would be really fun.
I can see why you compared medieval, reliquaries to power objects. They're both use objects. They both have, they both are difficult to capture in a museum today, to really capture power. Anyway, thank you very much. That was great.
Well, thank you very much on different aspects. And I'm learning for our next meeting, because what we would need now is the biology of the mudfish. Talking about objects, one of the former directors here, very famous director, actually went to the Congo. He collected these mudfish. He smuggled them into the US, which was very difficult. JFK, going through JFK with mudfish in your suitcase. And you know why? They play a major role in the scientific approach to not only regeneration, but kidney function. These fish, when they go into the mud, they have to slow down their metabolism, a lot of research about that. And their kidney function has to go down to almost zero. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive in the mud. So there is a lot of very fascinating biology, and we have found out here at the lab how the kidney functions using these objects and doing then biomedical research on these objects to understand how the kidney can survive. And even to this day, It's very powerful as an object to analyze and investigate how to make new kidneys.
Hmm. Of course, I knew that. I wanted you to say it first. I have no idea the biology of the mudfish. I tried, but it was really beyond my comprehension. Thank you for pointing that out. That's fascinating.
Context, because what it actually means is that they can survive very extreme conditions.
Mhm.
I mean, when they are in the mud, you know, then you have no water for weeks and months. And then when the water comes back, they totally regenerate. And this is why they're so powerful next to the Portuguese.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be interesting to pursue. How much of that goes into the oral sort of explanation? Yeah. Sure.
No, they were not alive, and they rot very fast. And there are famous descriptions how Homer Smith went to customs, and the suitcases were soaked.
They dry very well and fry very well. I know that. Yes.
How large are they?
Oh, they're pretty big. They can be over 3 feet. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Your question was how big are they?
Yes.
And I said they're big. They're probably around 3 feet.
So I was wondering about these nails in some of these sculptures that you show, like the one, but I think can yeah. So the question I have about these nails is, how sure are you that they are put by sculpture and not by, because these are also the object of rituals. So you
Mhm.
know, people, everyone who's coming for sacred whatever pilgrimage may put one nail in the sculpture at a time. So how do you know that it's not put by the visitors or the pilgrimage? And
Oh, right. Well, that's a good question. This is not an object of pilgrimage. This is a secretive object as well that belongs to a community. So it's not that it's on constant display. It has its own guardian. And you need to have a kind of special appointment and kind of a proof, you know, an RX for a, you know, your prescription before you can do any of these things. It's not that anyone can go anywhere near it and stick a nail in. This is no, so these were used for about 30 years. That's not to say that the idea or tradition of the object goes back to the first contact with the Portuguese again, because you have them in the Vatican seals dropping as idols as Christianity replaces traditional religions.
The nails are put in over time, and who is
Yes.
actually putting the nails in?
You would, if you were making a pact, you would have to
Okay.
put some part of yourself into that object.
Thanks for a really very fascinating talk. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about the process of investing the statues with color with palm oil. If you could maybe speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, so you know, the object has to be ready for it to be introduced to the community. So this can take a very long time. Palm oil, these are porous woods, they're hardwoods, but they will absorb the palm oil quite readily. And if you go to a museum collection and you see something that was collected, you know, let's say in the 60s, 70s, they still ooze that palm oil. You'll see it in the cases, it drips still. So it's continuously imbued with that oil.
Thanks. I'm sorry, this is kind of a selfish question, but I noticed that you had a Margaret Burroughs image that you didn't show.
Oh,
And I wondered because I was actually thinking with the nail figures, thinking about the Southside Community Arts Center in Chicago, which she co-founded, because one of the really interesting things about the walls in the exhibition space in that building is the fact that the the nail holes from all of the art that's ever been shown there are preserved because it's wood paneling as opposed to kind of like the white gallery walls. And I just have wondered if there's a kind of connection there to, I mean, it's not the nails themselves, but it's all these nail holes that are still there that are kind of reflecting the memory of all of the artists who've ever, shown their work there. So I was curious about what the connection to Margaret Burroughs was.
It was basically what I was, at some point I was going to do is to show the longevity of these associations of the mudfish, and in the diaspora of Margaret Burroughs, Benin art has been very important in the African American kind of definition of culture, pre-slavery. So Margaret Burroughs here, you've got, Black Venus coming out of the waters, but she's got these mudfish rather than, horses or other creatures coming with her. So I was going to propose that she may have been aware of this and that she was replacing a kind of indigenous source of power rather than the European side. Yeah.
So could you comment on, well, actually, I'm going back to Rebecca's excellent question yesterday, what is the history of the science of mudfish, for example, right? And I think of probably colonial natural history. Mudfish live in Africa, they live in Australia, New Zealand. I don't know, where else do they live? Herman, mudfish. Okay. Well, anyway, so I'm pretty sure, not knowing anything, that we would go back to a natural history that was collected and images were made of mudfish at that time. And this is also the moment of collecting, cultural objects, and, the moment of greater sense of, modernity, that we are modern and these other objects are pre-modern. And also that, we have art, which is different from what this is, these objects of use and spiritual objects. And so, I'm wondering in terms of what we might discuss, Jerry, next time, and Herman, that, looking into that moment of, how did these natural things come into the purview of, what was the history of the science of many of these things that inhabit, that are in places that were colonized. Anyway, that was a set of.
This is very fascinating because you have been talking about lungfish, but I think we could talk about axolotl in early American art in the mid-Americas. And then how did axolotl then, on the one hand, go into Brag's lab or come into Brag's lab? But on the other hand, there are lots of objects of axolotls in modern art.
And you have to wonder if, there was an observation of those quote unquote superpowers, the ability to regenerate. We know that's true with axolotl. That is really what gave it that significance in the culture. And you'd have to think the same is true probably for the mudfish in some way.
There, that. I mean, when it's hot and then they're baked in mud. I mean, there you can only see there's the soil. I mean, the fish are completely gone, and then water comes back, and then all of a sudden the fish are alive again. So that's very powerful. In Africa, he traveled there. I mean, he traveled a lot. He bought lambs in Vienna, Art Deco, which we still have here on campus. We don't have any mudfish left, but he published very nicely on mudfish.
Yeah, I'm watching time. Risham, thank you so much for
You're welcome.
energizing our morning or the really intellectual caffeine for us. I have two thoughts about axolotls and their Central American kind of habitat. And in preparing and thinking very much for our meeting today, I started looking at paintings by Hieronymus Bosch, 1506, so forth, right after the conquest, or just about the time of the conquest, after Columbus, certainly discovery so-called of this continent. And the analysis or the study of his painting so often centers on spiritual notions of what these crazy creatures are that he has swimming in the water and coming out. But I have, exactly as was suggested, wondered what, not direct observation, but the report of observation that might have stimulated some of these bizarre things that he's representing. So I think we have a lot of work to do in thinking now about these larger areas. A second